The autumn of 1883 brought an early frost to Silverton Creek, Montana territory, along with the kind of injustice that made Sheriff Samuel Hartwell question everything he believed about law and order. As he stood outside the courthouse, watching the crowd disperse after the verdict, Sam felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Inside the jail cell, 20-year-old Rose McKenna sat on the narrow cot with her hands folded in her lap, her dark hair falling like a curtain around a face that held more dignity than most people managed in their finest moments. She had been sentenced to hang for a murder Sam knew in his bones she hadn't committed, but the evidence, circumstantial as it was, had been enough to convince a jury already predisposed to distrust a deaf woman with no family to speak for her. Sam had been sheriff of Silverton Creek for 7 years, long enough to know that frontier justice was often more about satisfying public outrage than finding the truth. But this case haunted him in ways that went beyond professional frustration. Rose McKenna was innocent, and in 3 days, she would die for a crime committed by someone else. The murder of wealthy rancher William Garrett had shocked the small community. Garrett had been found shot in his own parlor, and Rose had been discovered nearby, covered in his blood, unable to explain her presence or defend herself against the accusations that followed. Her deafness had made her an easy target for suspicion, a convenient scapegoat for a town that wanted quick answers and simple justice. Sam entered the jail and approached Rose's cell, noting how she looked up at him with those remarkable blue-gray eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. She had been born deaf, according to the few details anyone knew about her background, and had worked as a seamstress in Garrett's household for the past 6 months. Beyond that, Rose McKenna was a mystery, a young woman with no voice to defend herself and no one willing to listen if she had one. "Miss McKenna," Sam said quietly, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Over the past week, he had learned to speak slowly and clearly so she could read his lips, one of the few accommodations the court had made for her condition. Rose straightened slightly, her attention focusing entirely on his face with the intense concentration of someone who had learned to gather information through sight alone. Sam had grown to respect that focus, the way she missed nothing, not the slightest change in expression, not the smallest gesture or shift in body language. "I want you to know," Sam continued carefully, "that I don't believe you killed William Garrett. I think you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone used your presence there to cover their own crime." Rose's eyes widened slightly, and she pressed her lips together in what Sam had learned was her way of controlling strong emotion. She gestured toward the courthouse, then shook her head with her expression of resigned acceptance that broke Sam's heart. "The jury made their decision based on fear and prejudice," Sam said, his voice rough with suppressed anger. "They saw a deaf woman who couldn't defend herself, and they took the easy answer instead of looking for the real killer." Rose studied his face for a long moment, then did something that surprised him. She stood and approached the bars of her cell, reaching through to briefly touch his hand where it rested on the iron rail. The gesture was gentle and grateful, acknowledging his belief in her innocence even when it couldn't save her life. Sam felt the warmth of her touch long after she had withdrawn her hand. There was something about Rose McKenna that drew him in ways he couldn't entirely explain, not just her obvious innocence or the injustice of her situation, but something deeper. In her silence, he sensed a strength and perceptiveness that unsettled him, as if she could see truths that others missed. That evening, Sam sat in his small office, staring at the legal documents that would end Rose's life in 2 days. Territorial law was clear. Once a sentence was passed, only marriage to a man of good standing could commute a woman's death sentence to life imprisonment. It was an archaic provision, a remnant of older legal traditions that assumed women needed male protection and guidance. The idea had been growing in Sam's mind for hours, despite its apparent insanity. He was 35 years old, a confirmed bachelor who had dedicated his life to keeping the peace in a place where peace was often a fragile and temporary thing. He had no family, few close friends, and no romantic entanglements to complicate such a decision. What he did have was a deep sense of justice and an absolute certainty that Rose McKenna deserved to live. The next morning, Sam approached Judge Cornelius Wade with his proposal. Wade was a reasonable man, though bound by the rigid interpretation of territorial law that had led to Rose's conviction. "Sheriff Hartwell," Judge Wade said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care, "are you seriously suggesting that you marry this woman to save her from execution?" "I am, Your Honor. The law provides for such a commutation, and Miss McKenna is innocent of the charges against her. Innocent or guilty, she was convicted by a jury of her peers. The law has spoken. The law also provides for mercy, Judge, and I'm willing to take responsibility for her future conduct as her husband." Judge Wade studied Sam with the keen eyes of a man who had spent decades weighing human nature against legal precedent. "Sheriff, you understand that such a marriage would be legally binding? That you would be taking on a wife who cannot hear, cannot speak, and has been convicted of murder. I understand completely. And you're prepared for the reaction of the townspeople? They won't understand your motives, and many will see this as a mockery of justice." Sam had considered this extensively. His reputation in Silverton Creek was solid, built on years of fair dealing and competent law enforcement. But marrying Rose would certainly cause talk, speculation, and probably outright condemnation from some quarters. "Judge, I've been keeping the peace in this territory for 7 years. In that time, I've seen innocent people suffer and guilty ones go free. This is my chance to prevent one clear injustice, and I'm willing to accept the consequences." Judge Wade was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Sheriff. If Miss McKenna consents to the marriage, I'll commute her sentence to life imprisonment in your custody. But understand, this decision will change both your lives irrevocably." When Sam returned to the jail to present the proposal to Rose, he found her sitting by the small window, watching the morning light filter through the bars. She turned as he approached, and Sam was struck again by the intelligence in her eyes, the way she seemed to read his mood and intentions before he spoke a word. "Miss McKenna," Sam began slowly, "I have a proposition that might save your life. It's not ideal, and it will require sacrifices from both of us, but it's the only legal option available." Rose tilted her head slightly, her expression curious and attentive. "If you agree to marry me, Judge Wade will commute your death sentence. You would live, but as my wife, under my supervision and protection." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Rose stared at him for what felt like hours, her eyes searching his face with that unnerving intensity that made Sam feel as if she could see directly into his soul. Finally, Rose nodded once, a gesture that was both acceptance and surrender. But as she looked at him in the dim light of the jail cell, Sam had the strangest feeling that Rose McKenna understood far more about his offer and about him than he had intended to reveal. In that moment of silent communication, Sam realized he might be saving Rose's life, but he had no idea what she might do to his. The wedding ceremony took place the following morning in Judge Wade's chambers, with only the judge's clerk and Doc Morrison as witnesses. Sam had chosen Doc not just for his discretion, but because the old physician had been one of the few people in town to express doubts about Rose's guilt. Rose wore a simple gray dress that someone, Sam suspected Doc Morrison's wife, had brought for the occasion. Her dark hair was neatly braided and pinned, and despite the circumstances, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made Sam's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. As Judge Wade began the ceremony, Sam found himself studying Rose's profile, noting the way she watched the judge's lips with complete concentration. When Wade spoke the traditional words about marriage being a sacred bond, Rose's eyes flickered to Sam's face, and he saw something there that made him wonder if she understood more about the significance of what they were doing than he did. "Sheriff Hartwell," Judge Wade said, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Sam replied, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. Judge Wade turned to Rose, speaking slowly and clearly. "Rose McKenna, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live." Rose nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by placing her hand over her heart and extending it toward Sam, a gesture so eloquent that spoken words would have seemed inadequate. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana," Judge Wade concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." When it came time for the traditional kiss, Sam hesitated, acutely aware that this was not a normal wedding between two people who loved each other. But Rose resolved his uncertainty by stepping closer and placing her hand gently on his chest, over his heart. Then she rose on her toes and kissed his cheek with such tenderness that Sam felt something shift inside him. After the ceremony, Sam led Rose to his modest house at the edge of town, acutely conscious of the stares and whispers that followed them. News of the sheriff's marriage to the condemned woman had spread through Silverton Creek like wildfire, and the reactions ranged from shock to outright condemnation. Sam's house was clean but sparse, the home of a man who had lived alone for too long. As he showed Rose around, he found himself seeing it through her eyes, noting the absence of feminine touches, the purely functional furniture, the general atmosphere of solitude that permeated every room. "This is your room," Sam said, opening the door to the spare bedroom. He had spent the previous evening making it as comfortable as possible, adding extra blankets and even a small vase of wildflowers that now seemed embarrassingly inadequate. Rose stepped into the room and looked around slowly, taking in every detail. Then she turned to Sam and pressed her palms together, touching them to her lips, a gesture he interpreted as thanks. That first evening was awkward in the way that all new arrangements are, complicated by the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Sam prepared a simple dinner while Rose explored the kitchen, familiarizing herself with the layout and contents with the methodical thoroughness of someone who relied on visual information. As they ate, Sam attempted conversation, speaking slowly so Rose could read his lips. "I want you to know," he said, "that this marriage is in name only. You're safe here, and I won't expect anything from you that you're not willing to give." Rose set down her fork and looked at him with an intensity that made Sam feel exposed. She gestured toward herself, then toward him, then made a questioning motion with her hands. "I'm sorry," Sam said. "I don't understand." Rose tried again, this time pointing to her heart, then to Sam, then making a protective gesture with her arms. Sam realized she was asking if he had feelings for her, or if this was purely a rescue mission. "I believe you're innocent," Sam said carefully, "and I believe everyone deserves justice. Beyond that," he paused, struggling with honesty. "Beyond that, I don't know yet." Rose nodded, seeming to accept his uncertainty. But as the evening progressed, Sam became increasingly aware of how she watched him. Not just his lips when he spoke, but his expressions, his gestures, the way he held himself. It was as if she was reading an entire conversation that he wasn't aware he was having. When Sam mentioned his years as sheriff, Rose tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. When he talked about the challenges of keeping peace in a frontier town, she leaned forward slightly, as if she sensed something beneath his words. And when he briefly mentioned his family, parents and a younger brother lost to fever 5 years earlier, Rose's expression softened with what looked remarkably like understanding. "You see a lot, don't you?" Sam said quietly, more to himself than to Rose. But Rose heard him, not his words, but something else. She reached across the small space between them and briefly touched his hand, her eyes conveying a sympathy that suggested she knew exactly what kind of losses he had endured. That night, as Sam lay in his bedroom, listening to the small sounds Rose made moving around the house, he found himself thinking about her perceptiveness. In the few hours they had spent together, she had somehow picked up on his grief, his loneliness, and the carefully controlled emotions he thought he had hidden so well. The next morning brought their first real challenge as a married couple. Mrs. Adelaide Patterson, the town's self-appointed moral authority, arrived at Sam's door with a delegation of concerned citizens. Sam answered the door to find 6 stern-faced townspeople on his porch, their expressions ranging from disapproving to openly hostile. "Sheriff Hartwell, Mrs. Patterson began without preamble. "We need to discuss this situation you've created." "What situation would that be, Mrs. Patterson?" Sam asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "Your marriage to that murderer. The town is in an uproar. Sheriff, people are saying you've lost your mind, that you can't be trusted to maintain law and order if you're married to a convicted killer." Sam felt his temper rising, but before he could respond, Rose appeared beside him in the doorway. She took in the hostile delegation with a single glance, then moved closer to Sam, not hiding behind him, but positioning herself as his partner, facing a shared challenge. Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed as she looked at Rose. The girl doesn't even have the decency to look ashamed of what she's done. Rose couldn't hear the words, but she could read the hostility in Mrs. Patterson's expression. What she did next surprised everyone. She looked directly at Mrs. Patterson, placed her hand over her heart, and shook her head slowly, not in denial, but in what looked remarkably like pity. "Your wife seems to have some spirit," Mrs. Patterson said coldly to Sam. "I hope you can control her better than you controlled this situation." After the delegation left, grumbling threats about finding a new sheriff, Sam turned to Rose with something approaching awe. "You knew exactly what that was about, didn't you?" Even without hearing a word. Rose's response was to touch his shoulder gently, then point to his chest. Sam realized she was telling him that she could read his emotions, his stress, his anger at the town's reaction. Somehow, in the span of a day, Rose had learned to interpret him in ways that went far beyond lip reading. As they stood together in his doorway, watching the delegation retreat down the dusty street, Sam began to understand that his new wife possessed an intelligence and insight that transcended her deafness. Rose might not be able to hear spoken words, but she was listening to something far more fundamental, the unspoken language of human hearts. And if that was true, Sam realized with a mixture of wonder and unease, then Rose probably already knew things about him that he had never told another living soul. 2 weeks into their marriage, Sam discovered that living with Rose was like being studied by a gentle but relentless scholar whose subject was the human soul. She moved through his house with quiet efficiency, somehow intuiting which routines he valued and which he would welcome her changing. More unsettling was the way she seemed to anticipate his moods, appearing with coffee when he was frustrated, maintaining respectful distance when he was wrestling with difficult decisions, and offering silent comfort when the weight of his responsibilities grew too heavy. On this particular evening, Sam sat at his kitchen table reading reports about a series of cattle thefts that had been plaguing the territory. The paperwork was tedious, the trail was growing cold, and Sam could feel the familiar tension building behind his eyes that signaled an approaching headache. Without a sound, Rose appeared beside him carrying a damp cloth and a cup of tea that smelled of mint and something else he couldn't identify. She set the tea within his reach, then waited with the cloth in her hands, her eyebrows raised in a gentle question. "How did you know?" Sam asked, looking up at her with amazement that had become routine over the past 2 weeks. Rose touched her temple, then gestured toward him, indicating that she had seen the signs of his developing headache in his posture, his expressions, or some other detail that escaped his notice. When he nodded gratefully, she gently placed the cool cloth across his forehead, her touch so careful and precise that Sam felt the tension begin to dissolve immediately. As Rose moved away to continue her evening tasks, Sam found himself watching her with growing wonder. She had transformed his stark bachelor quarters into something approaching a home, not through dramatic changes, but through subtle touches that spoke of feminine presence and care. Wildflowers appeared in simple vases. Meals became more varied and flavorful, and his clothes were mended with stitches so small and even they were nearly invisible. But it was her uncanny ability to read his emotional state that continued to unsettle him. Sam had spent years perfecting the controlled, professional demeanor that served him well as a sheriff. He prided himself on being unreadable, on keeping his personal feelings separate from his public duties. Yet Rose seemed to see through that carefully maintained facade as if it were made of glass. The proof came 3 days later when Deputy Charlie Morrison brought news that made Sam's blood run cold. "Sheriff," Charlie said, bursting into the office with obvious excitement. "We got a lead on the Garrett murder. Billy Hutchins was drunk last night and started bragging about knowing who really killed the old man." Sam's heart began to race. If there was evidence that Rose was innocent, real evidence, not just his instincts, then perhaps her conviction could be overturned. What did Hutchins say? Said he saw Frank Dalton leaving Garrett's house the night of the murder, covered in blood and carrying Garrett's money box. Apparently Dalton paid Hutchins to keep quiet, but Hutchins has been drinking away the guilt ever since. Frank Dalton was Garrett's nephew, a gambler and drifter who had been in town for several weeks before the murder. Sam had always suspected him, but Dalton had provided an alibi and left town immediately after Rose's arrest. Where's Hutchins now? Sobered up and scared. He's willing to testify if we can guarantee his protection from Dalton's friends. Sam felt a surge of hope so strong it was almost painful. Rose might not just be innocent. She might be provably innocent, which meant freedom, vindication, and an end to the injustice that had brought them together. When Sam arrived home that evening, Rose took one look at his face and immediately set aside the sewing she had been working on. She approached him with the intense focus he had come to recognize, her eyes searching his expression for clues to his emotional state. "Rose," Sam said, barely able to contain his excitement, "I have news about your case. Good news." He explained about Hutchins's testimony and the possibility of proving her innocence, speaking slowly and watching her face for signs of understanding. What he saw there surprised him. Not the joy and relief he had expected, but something more complex. Rose nodded thoughtfully, then reached for the slate and chalk she used for more complicated communications. "Will this change things between us?" she wrote in her neat, careful script. The question caught Sam off guard. In his excitement about potentially clearing her name, he hadn't considered what vindication might mean for their marriage. If Rose was exonerated, she would be free to leave, to start over somewhere else, to build a life that wasn't shadowed by false accusations and forced circumstances. "Do you want it to?" Sam asked quietly. Rose studied his face for a long moment, her slate forgotten in her lap. Then she did something that took his breath away. She placed both hands over his heart and closed her eyes, as if listening to something only she could hear. When she opened her eyes, they were bright with unshed tears. She picked up her slate again and wrote, "Your heart is lonely. It has been lonely for a long time, even before you married me." Sam stared at the words, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with Rose's deafness and everything to do with her extraordinary ability to see truths he had hidden even from himself. "How do you know that?" he whispered. Rose erased the slate and wrote, "The way you stand when you think no one is watching. The way you touch things that belong to your family. The way you smile with your mouth, but not your eyes when people call you lucky to be a bachelor." Sam felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling under the weight of her perceptions. "Rose, She held up a hand to stop him, then wrote, "I was lonely too, even before the trial, before the accusations. Being deaf in a hearing world is like being surrounded by people who speak a language you can only partly understand. And now," Rose set down her slate and moved closer to Sam, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her blue-gray eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to cling to her clothes. "Now," she said aloud, her voice soft and slightly slurred in the way of someone who had never heard spoken words, "I hear you." It was the first time Sam had heard her speak, and the sound of her voice, imperfect but beautiful in its honesty, nearly undid him completely. "Rose," he said, reaching up to cup her face gently in his hands. "What are you saying?" Instead of answering with words, Rose placed her hands over his again, creating the connection that had become their most intimate form of communication. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, not on the cheek as she had at their wedding, but on the lips, with a tenderness that spoke of genuine affection rather than gratitude. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Sam saw his own wonder reflected in Rose's eyes. "I don't want things to change," Rose wrote on her slate when she could steady her hands enough to hold the chalk. "Even if I'm proven innocent, I want to stay married to you. Not because I have to, but because I choose to." Sam looked at this remarkable woman who had somehow seen past his professional competence to the lonely man beneath, who had offered him understanding and companionship when he hadn't even realized how desperately he needed both. "Are you sure?" he asked. "If you're exonerated, you'll be free to go anywhere, do anything. You won't need my protection anymore." Rose smiled then, the first truly joyful expression Sam had seen from her since that day in the jail cell. She wrote, "I never needed your protection, Sam. I needed your heart, and you need mine." As they sat together in the lamplight, holding hands and planning a future that had started with desperate necessity but was growing into something that felt remarkably like love, Sam marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had married Rose to save her life, but she was saving his in ways he was only beginning to understand. In her silence, she had heard the things that mattered most. And in her extraordinary gift for reading hearts, she had found the one person who could truly listen to hers. Spring arrived in Silverton Creek with melting snow, blooming wildflowers, and a surprising twist. Frank Dalton returned in shackles, bringing the evidence that cleared Rose's name and exposed the corruption behind her wrongful conviction. In a crowded courtroom, Sam barely listened to Judge Wade's ruling. His eyes were fixed on Rose, calm and radiant in a soft blue dress, her freedom finally restored. "All charges against Rose McKenna Hartwell are dismissed," the judge declared. Some in the crowd clapped, others looked away in shame. Rose turned to Sam, tears falling, her smile glowing with vindication. Walking home, they were greeted by well-wishers, including Mrs. Patterson, once one of Rose's harshest critics. "I owe you an apology," she said. Rose offered a simple gesture of forgiveness, a gentle touch to her hand. "You're a better person than I am," Sam told her. On her slate, Rose wrote, "Forgiveness is for me. Anger makes me deaf to more than sound." That evening, watching the sunset from their porch, Sam finally asked, "Now that you're free, what do you want? You can go anywhere." Rose wrote carefully, "I want to stay with you. Not because I have to, because I belong here." She placed her hand over his heart and spoke softly, "Your heart was afraid I'd leave." Sam's breath caught. "And your heart? It told your heart, I'm already home." Sam cradled her face. "I love you, not just for saving you, but because you saved me too." "I loved you from the first day," Rose replied. "You heard my heart when no one else did." Their kiss was no longer born of gratitude. It was love, true and undeniable. 6 months later, the Hartwell home had become a quiet hub of comfort and wisdom. Rose, now a trusted presence, helped local women with troubles words couldn't fix. Sam often found her on the porch with neighbors, offering empathy and calm through silent gestures and steady presence. One evening, Sam came home to her soft humming in the kitchen, her voice still imperfect but filled with warmth. "Mrs. Collins came by," Rose said. "Her husband drinks too much. She doesn't know what to do." "And what did you tell her?" "Nothing." "I listened. Her heart is sad but strong." Sam kissed her head, touched by her quiet strength. "How do you know?" "Because hearts that survive sadness are the strongest. Like yours. Like mine." Later he asked, "Do you regret how it all started?" Rose held his face and whispered, "Never. The most beautiful things grow from the darkest soil. Our love is proof." As twilight fell over the mountains, they sat together in silence, wrapped in the comfort of a love that didn't rely on sound. Sam had once married Rose to save her life, but she had saved his in ways he hadn't understood. She hadn't just felt his heartbeat, she had learned to speak its language. And in teaching him how to listen with his heart, she had given him the truest gift of all, the ability to hear love in silence.